Welcome to Morning Roll Call. This week, the scariest thing in law enforcement. Morning Roll Call starts now. Welcome, everybody. This is the 131st episode of the podcast. This one that you are listening to is called Morning Roll Call. In here, it's just you and I. It can be anywhere from 10, 15 minutes up to about 30 minutes. It's a monologue show, so you just get to listen to me drone on for a little bit. However, our other show you definitely want to check out comes out on Thursday mornings at 0500, and that's called The Interview Room. In The Interview Room, I sit down with people from all walks of life, typically law enforcement, and we just really hear some great things about what they are doing. If you missed last Thursday's episode, it was with Scott Medlin. He's doing really great work, retired from law enforcement, written some excellent books that will help out law enforcement officers. So if you're in this career, if you're thinking of entering this career, if you've retired from this career, you definitely want to follow the things that Scott is doing. He's also going to be the keynote speaker at the COPS Conference, the National COPS Conference, which I believe is this upcoming weekend in Dallas, Texas. So be sure to go back and listen to that episode if you haven't had an opportunity yet. And then this coming Thursday, I get to sit down with Keith Malinak. I'm very excited about that one. I've loved following him and what he's doing there at the Blaze, but he is the producer of Pat Gray Unleashed, which is comes out in the morning on the Blaze Network. So you definitely want to listen to that one. It's a little bit different. We don't get deep into law enforcement. We actually talk about all sorts of other subjects, and we get a little bit into politics because that's obviously what his show is all about. So it's really good stuff, and he also has his own podcast, At the Mic with Keith. So definitely you'll learn more about that when you listen to this Thursday's episode. So this week, a little bit different. Normally, I start out with some news stories. I start out with something crazy to tell you about, and then we get into something to think about for the week ahead. This week, and actually for a few weeks here, due to some scheduling issues and stuff, these are going to be a little bit shorter, and we're essentially just going to get to something to think about. So today is, of course, Halloween. And so I thought, what is better than go over something scary? I mean, I could put some pictures of some politicians up here. I guess that'd be a little scary. But I decided to not go that direction. Instead, I've had the privilege lately of being on some other podcast. It's something that I've really been trying to push forward, been trying to get get what we're doing here. And thank you. This is nothing if you, the listener, doesn't come along. And so I've had the opportunity to be on some other podcasts. And one of those was Hear Some Evil with Emerson Souza. And I'll have a link below, and then you'll hear more about it coming up. Just so you know, every show that I go on as a guest, I then link up on the Blue Line. And if you go to ontheblueline.com and look at guest appearances, you will see the different podcasts that I've been on. And the advantage to that is you get to hear my story, and you get to hear why I came to On the Blue Line and why we're doing what we're doing. So hopefully you will find those enjoyable. During my conversation with Emerson, he wanted to know, he's non-law enforcement, and he had a great conversation and some great questions surrounding this idea of, what it was like policing during certain events, right? So he would talk about specifically 2020. Obviously, that is something that still is affecting law enforcement today. And he wanted to know, hey, what was it like, in those early days of COVID? And we talked about that. And besides getting into, what it became and so forth, in the moment, there was a lot of uncertainty, right, in those early days in March of 2020, and especially for law enforcement because, and also like nurses and so forth, as we all know, we've heard it, but depending on what career field they were in, what really was concerning early on was the uncertainty, because you didn't know, right? You heard what the news was saying, you heard what government officials were saying, and you just didn't know. The same was true in what came later in that summer. And you'll definitely want to listen to the whole episode with Emerson, and we go into all this much deeper, because this really isn't where we're going to end today. It's just the starting point. But we went into, the craziness that came from like the defund the police movement and the mostly peaceful riots that took over the summer, and, all of this craziness that was going on. And the question that he kept asking is, well, how does it affect law enforcement? What was your thoughts being in law enforcement? What was that like? And I kept coming back to this idea of uncertainty, right? And so today, since we had to talk about something scary, since it is Halloween, I was thinking, I think the scariest thing we deal with in law enforcement is the unknown, right? Or uncertainty. And I get it. That's a broad stroke way to look at it. You could certainly look at it differently and be like, oh, well, this specific incident, this is scary, or this is, absolutely. But speaking in broad strokes, speaking at just as a whole, what is something that is scary that law enforcement gets into? And I would say it's somewhere between the unknown and uncertainty. I remember early on sitting for an oral board. And when I say early on, probably about the midway point of my career. And I remember sitting at an oral board, and for those of you non-law enforcement, essentially it's an interview process. There's usually different ranks there in front of you. So if you're, let's say, a patrol officer level, then you probably have a sergeant, lieutenant, maybe a captain on this oral board. And for whatever purpose it is, it can be to be hired early on. It can be for promotional abilities as you go through your career, and it can be for transferring to other units. But you sit before pretty much a panel, or what they call an oral board. And I remember a question that I had gotten early on, or in this time period, and they said, what is the scariest call that you ever went to? And I thought of some different ones, right? I thought of, some that ended in a loss of life. I thought of some that, it involved the potential for violence towards me. I thought of, and I said, well, I think the one that I would say was the most nerve-wracking, the scariest from just not knowing what I was getting into, was actually responding to a 911 call in which there was very little information. It was pretty much like a 911 hang-up. So I went out to this house, and so at the time, the area I'm in has changed substantially, but at the time, the street wasn't even paved that this house was off of. And I get out to the home, and it actually sits on a large piece of property, and then it was like a modular style home. And so it had a little porch area in the front, and there's no street lighting. There's no real lighting on the house. There's no real lighting in the area because, again, you're probably on half acre or more lots. Some are acre, 2 acres, and fenced in. And then the house itself is just kind of sitting in the middle of this lot, and this was the wee hours of the morning, so it was very dark out. So I go up to this home, and I'm knocking, and I'm no answer. And so I go around the home, and I'm trying to see, is there any way to kind of see anything that looks disturbed, right? So when you go out to a 911 hang up, essentially someone called 911 and then they hung up their phone, and it's coming back to this location, not always the same house, but typically that location. So you're trying to determine in the moment, hey, is someone in distress? Did something happen and then they left? All these crazy, crazy things happen, as any of you who are in law enforcement know. And then, of course, I'm going into a little bit of more detail because I know I have a lot of listeners who are not in law enforcement. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unknown. Well, I go up to the house, and I'm knocking, and I'm walking around, and I'm knocking, and then finally I hear what sounds like someone coming to the door. And again, it's the wee hours of the morning, so you give ample time, because even when it is very innocuous, there's nothing going on, you still don't, if you woke me up in the wee hours of the morning, I'm sure if I woke you up in the wee hours of the morning, takes you a little while to get to the door. And if you come to the door, you probably have a firearm. Well, that's exactly what happened. But the difference is when he came to the door, I don't know if he saw, this was back in the day of uniforms that still had actual badges and stuff on them. So I don't know if it was the glinting and the moonlight or whatever that caught his eye. But next thing I know, it's an older gentleman opens the door, and what seems like, and anyone in law enforcement knows you don't stand in front of the door. You would offset yourself from the door for officer safety purposes, and if you can be back a little ways from the door. But this was a very small porch on a modular unit, so my options were either being up at the top or being down at the bottom. And where I'd position myself was as safe as it could be under the circumstances. Well, this gentleman comes out. He has this revolver in his hand, and he just sticks it right out to where he sees probably the glinting of the moonlight. Well, he's shaking. He clearly from advanced age, or I don't know if he had some medical concerns, but he's sitting there and he's just shaking as he's holding this gun pretty much right at me. And I remember thinking, thankfully, as you can see, I'm here doing this podcast. Nothing came of it. I was able to identify myself. He safely put the weapon away. It fortunately did not discharge, even though he was shaking like a leaf. But I remember thinking in that moment that that is the most dangerous thing we deal with, right? In law enforcement, it's the unknown. See, it used to be you had low risk and high risk traffic stops, right? Well, you still have high risk traffic stops, but they've added unknown risk traffic stops. Because the reality is everything you go to is unknown. There's no telling what you might get yourself into. You just kind of hope to default to your training and to your education that you've learned in this career field to stay safe. Well, I wanted to continue this idea, right? And then apply it to our lives, because that's what we do here. If you're new to Morning Roll Call, is I normally throw out something that has something to do with law enforcement, and then I apply it to our lives. So what's the takeaway when we talk about dealing with uncertainty, or we talk about dealing with the unknown? Well, there are definitely some crossovers. I found a good article, it's linked up in the show notes for you, from Berkeley, where they talk about 7 ways to cope with uncertainty, and it's part of what they call their Greater Good magazine. It's like a mental health type magazine. And I saw a few of the things that they mentioned on there that I thought not only applied to what law enforcement does, but kind of applies to our response, right? So one of the ones they mentioned was this idea of self-care. And I know we talk about it all the time on here, probably to ad nauseum. I get it. But it's this invest in yourself. Well, taking that one step further, looking at it from the law enforcement side, one of the things you do in law enforcement is you're training for that moment, right? Like even how you orient yourself to the door, like I was talking about. Everything is about training, getting better, getting more proficient, getting safer in your response. That is what you do. That way, when uncertainty comes, hopefully your training is going to keep you alive, right? Well, that is kind of the same principle when it comes to taking care of ourselves and training in our personal lives, right? We are all going to face uncertainty. We all are going to face the unknown. And sometimes it is downright scary. When the phone rings and you get bad news, or when you don't hear from somebody for a long period of time and all of a sudden your heart starts beating. I mean, some of these things, they're not within our control, right? Like you can't train for that bad phone call that's coming. And we'll get to how we can deal with those here in a minute. But there are things we can train for. There are uncertainties that we can improve at, where we can invest in our own self-care and in our own mental health to be in a position to walk through these things. A second idea is this idea of don't believe everything you think, right? So just because you believe something to be true doesn't make it true. And just because you believe something not to be true doesn't make it untrue. Right? That's your belief doesn't have any bearing on what is and what isn't. And one thing that we find is a lot of times people, we all, myself included, we have this worst case scenario thinking, right? Everything is the sky is falling. So when we're faced with the unknown, when the phone doesn't ring or when something happens, we immediately go worst case scenario. Now, I have to put a caveat on this one, right? When you're training for the unknown, then worst case scenario is what you want to train for, right? You don't train for saving cats out of trees. You train for that day when everything has gone off the rails and people's safety is at risk. And what can you do in that moment to help them out and to protect them, right? So you're training worst case scenario, but you can't always think worst case scenario, right? And I find myself doing this. And if you've heard me talk on any of these podcasts that I'm referencing, one of the things I often talk about is the fact that that thinking comes from the fact that we see everybody, almost everybody, on the worst days of their life when you're in law enforcement. So we take that a step further. And when we are in our own lives, when we're outside of the job, then oftentimes we're looking at things as though they're worst case scenario. So that is something that once we recognize it, then we don't have to go down that road. We don't have to look at things as being worst case scenario. We can look at them for what they are, evaluate, and then act or react accordingly, as we just spoke about last week. So the third and final thing that I want to leave you with is finding meaning in chaos. And I encourage you to read this entire article because they have a whole lot of great ideas in here, but I just distilled it down to 3 that really resonated with me and where I was at. But finding meaning in chaos. So humans need significance. They need to feel like they matter. They need to feel like what they're dealing with matters. It's why people come into this career, right? Oftentimes, it is a matter of significance. They'll say, well, I came into law enforcement because I want to help people, which is noble. That's awesome. That's great. But a lot of times there is a personal side of that where they want to feel significant. They want to feel like why do people do things for others? Sure, the heart, empathy, we can go down all those roads, but ultimately it's because they want to feel like I've done something to make a difference in someone else's life. That's significant. So when we apply these three things to the unknown, right? When we approach the unknown, we got to be well trained and prepared. In other words, think about in our own lives, what are things that when there's uncertainty involved, when there's unknown, that throws us into a tailspin. And in turn, make sure that we are investing in self-care, self-preparation, and being ready, right? You know, when we talk about safety, there's all sorts of sites out there, right, that talk about personal self-defense and so forth. And probably one of the big takeaways with the whole self-defense mantra is to be ready for anything, right? If you're sitting around eating Cheetos and sitting on the couch and watching television and you're not doing a darn thing, and then the day comes that you got to run a mile or you got to run into a burning house and throw someone over your shoulders and run out, well, that day's going to go really, really bad, right? Well, it's going to go bad because you weren't prepared. So that's the lesson. The only way to deal with that potential uncertainty is to have been prepared in advance. The same is true. I'm actually going to be on a different podcast or actually I was on by the time you're watching this, but later this evening, I'm going to be on a recording on a podcast that will come on the weeks ahead. And it's going to be all over this whole idea of the response to the hurricanes, right? When you are dealing with tragedy, when you are dealing with the potential of something catastrophic like a hurricane, fire, whatever, this preparation side, like you can't train for maybe every aspect of what's going to come with that hurricane, but you can prepare. And you can also have yourself, the more prepared you are, the more that's going to benefit your mental side. And the more that benefits, the better decisions you're going to make when the potential tragedy even happens, because you have done everything you can do to have the safeguards in place to get through whatever you may be faced with. So when we approach the unknown, being well trained and prepared, controlling our thinking, and then looking for our meaning or purpose, we can and we will be able to face the unknown and uncertainty without fear. And in some cases, we might actually even welcome it. So that's all I have for you today. That does it for this week's Morning Roll Call. I'm going to see you Thursday in the interview room, but in the meantime, I'll see you out there on the Blue Line.